Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is James Robson. I'm the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard Asia Center and also teach in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations. And I'm very happy to be able to provide just the opening, some comments about today's event and give you a little idea about the structure. This event today is entitled Asia and Russia's War on Ukraine. This is part of the Asia Center's Asia Beyond the Headline series, which started in 2017 as a part of our different speaker series, is that really focus on contemporary issues that are important and that cut across Asia. And so this fits into that panel very well. Today's event, as I mentioned, is entitled Asia and Russia's War on Ukraine. This is, as you all can very well understand, a very timely event. Just yesterday, we had the important news about President Zelensky's call with leader Xi Jinping, which was described in the press as a, quote, long and meaningful phone call, whatever that means exactly. But this was momentous in the sense that this was the first contact between the two leaders since Russia's invasion on Ukraine. And Xi Jinping, interestingly, as the press reported, or at least the readout was, didn't mention Russia, nor did he use the word war in those set of comments. But nonetheless, he was sticking to this so-called safe position of reiterating Beijing's desire to play a role in promoting peace and talks. This was an important moment, and we were very much hoping to have the Ukrainian foreign minister joining us by Zoom today, that is to say, the Honorable Dmytro Kuleba. But unfortunately, perhaps related to this call and the necessity of urgent travel, is unable to join us for this afternoon. But he did, very interestingly, not say that, sorry, good luck with your event, but rather said that he was very interested in participating at another time and doing a different event. And so we will work in exploring options to have him give a presentation at some time in the near future. So keep an eye out for that news. This moment that we face here in analyzing the war and Asia's position is very important and has been laid out in some of the main questions that were part of this putting together this event. How does Asia respond to Russia's war on Ukraine? What are the implications for Asian security and stability? And while Japan and South Korea have sided with the West and supported Ukraine, China and North Korea notably are deepening ties with Russia. And one could also bring in here the split that's happened in ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia as well, particularly with Myanmar supporting the Chinese and supporting the Russian, lining with China, and then also other countries like Singapore, for example, supporting sanctions on the other hand. So the security implications across Asia are important. The effects across Asia are equally important in terms of the challenges that this war has presented for, the entire rules-based order that I'm sure will be part of the discussion today, but also the crises that it's involving food security throughout Asia, rising agriculture and commodity prices, price of wheat and cooking oil in Southeast Asia in particular, other prices increases for fertilizer, economic inflation, energy issues, IT supply chain issues, all of these very important issues that are part of the consideration for today. So the way that things will be structured is I would like to first introduce Yana Kwan, who will be giving an opening presentation that will then be followed by a distinguished panel discussion after that. So let me begin by introducing Yana Kwan. She was born in Cologne, Germany, to South Korean parents. And she's an author and a broadcast journalist who's worked for German television and two public broadcasters, the ZDF and also WDR. And throughout her studies at the University of Cologne, she was a Konrad Adenauer Foundation Journalism Fellow and received a DAAD, one of those enviable German government grants, to study at the University of Warwick. She received her PhD in political science at the University of Cologne, and she wrote her thesis about South Korea-Japan relations compared to Germany and Poland. After research stays both at Korea University, Waseda University, and at UC Berkeley. As a Korea expert in Germany, Iena Kwan has reported on various U.S.-Asia-related topics about North Korea nuclear threat in 2017, and she was sent to the Pyongyang Winter Olympics in 2018, not to report on sports, but on Korean culture and politics. Before coming to Harvard, where she is now an associate of the Asia Center, she did extensive reporting on the German flood catastrophe in 2021 and produced a 30-minute documentary about the flood's dramatic aftermaths. At Harvard, she's been working on security politics in Asia, U.S.-East Asia relations, North Korea, and the politics of the European Union, but her current research is dedicated to today's topic of Asia and Russia's war on Ukraine. And I should throw in, I was given some information just breaking before inviting her up of a photo exhibition that is taking place across the street in the Fisher Family Commons of the Knopfel building that's entitled Ukraine Endures, Russia's War Against Ukraine in Pictures, that will be opening on May 10th, have a reception on May 10th, 5:30 to 7:30 p.m., so keep an eye out for that. So now let's turn things over to Iena and for your opening presentation, and thanks very much for all you did to help organize this, and looking forward to learning from your comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James, for this very kind introduction. I'm very glad and excited to stand here today in front of you. First of all, let me thank the whole Asia Center family who has supported this event. Thank you, Tenzin. Thank you, the entire family. And thank you to our dear sponsors of today's event. Let me first give you an outline of my presentation, which is really aimed at offering you a broader overview so that we can go deeper later on the panel. I will focus more on East Asia and address these 3 points. Okay, could someone help me with this PowerPoint, which is not working at the moment? Oh, interesting. All right. No problem. Number 1, what is Asia's response to the war in terms of condemnation, sanctions, and support? Number 2, what are the impacts on key alliances and alignments? And number 3, which will lead up to the panel afterwards, what are the major security challenges that will highly impact the geopolitical order in Asia? What's to be expected? And what's not to be expected. So before I dive in, let me start off with some news because I'm a journalist and I like to embed everything in the current environment. Right now, the South Korean president Yoon Suk-yeol is in the United States. He arrived on Monday for a 6-day trip, the first state visit to the US by a South Korean president in 12 years. It's the 70th anniversary of the US-ROK alliance, but this trip comes during challenging times. And one of the most critical topics next to North Korea is Russia's war on Ukraine, especially the question of military support, which I will come back later. Second, and James has already mentioned it in the introduction, just yesterday we learned that Ukraine's President Zelensky and China's President Xi Jinping had their first ever phone call since the outbreak of the war. A long conversation which apparently lasted for an hour. This brings a whole new dynamic into our topic today. Asia and Russia's war on Ukraine. Yes, it's true. The war in Europe is very far away, geographically speaking, and also in terms of cultural connections. But it has very strong implications for the economy in Asia, as well as security and defense, against the backdrop of shifting systemic shifts, of deepening tensions between the US and China, as well as the strategic partnership between Russia and China as well. And now, China's potential role as a peacemaker in this whole new conflict, especially since yesterday. This brings some hope, but for now, we have to stick to reality. And that is, Asia is deeply divided in its response to the war in Ukraine. Sometimes images can be more powerful than words. 2 state visits by 2 leaders, 2 handshakes, one in Moscow and one in Kyiv, about 800 kilometers apart. On March 21st, China's President Xi Jinping visits the Kremlin and shakes hands with his dear friend Vladimir Putin. And what Beijing frames as a peacemaking attempt is, of course, a blunt demonstration to the world that their strategic friendship is going to last for a while. And then, on March 22nd, just on the following day, Prime Minister Kishida makes this surprise visit to Kyiv and Bucha, showing support for the Ukrainians, as the first Prime Minister of Japan to enter a war zone since World War II. So Asia's response to the war has been very mixed. If you look at the last UN resolution from February 2023 calling for an immediate end to the war, 7 out of 141 member states voted against it, including North Korea. China and India abstained. These 3 countries, North Korea, China, and India, have been consistently and openly backing Putin's narrative, blaming NATO and the US for the war. They're not supporting international sanctions, not even using the term invasion, let alone criticizing Russia's war on Ukraine. But most Asian nations have voted in favor of the UN resolution. 9 out of 11 Southeast Asian countries support it. Singapore, the small city-state, has been the only country in Southeast Asia imposing sanctions against Russia. The only 2 Southeast Asian countries that abstained at the last UN resolution were Vietnam and Laos, 2 communist countries with long-standing relations to Russia. So the UN resolution is certainly important. It carries symbolic weight. However, voting for a non-binding resolution does not necessarily mean that they truly condemn the war. In fact, very few Asian countries have taken proactive measures to support Ukraine or to punish Russia. Out of 2 reasons, as I would argue. Number 1, fear. Fear that stems from a deep concern of getting dragged into the conflict between big power states. Russia's influence in Asia remains limited. But with China backing Russia, many countries are afraid of negative consequences which no one is going to pay for. And number 2, which is a consequence of fear, optionality. By choosing the path of optionality, by keeping silent, you keep that back door open for as long as possible, because siding too much with one side, siding too much with Ukraine, or siding too much with Russia might involve too many risks. But I want to raise this question. Can Asian states, in the long run, really stand outside of this conflict? For decades, many countries in Asia have tried to keep a balanced relationship in the geopolitical competition. But with the beginning of Russia's war on Ukraine, some states have already begun rethinking their role in this war. So let me focus on Japan and South Korea for a moment. 2 democracies in Asia, 2 rich nations, which have sided with their closest ally, the US, and have adopted a very supportive position. This position has shifted, though. They used to be very hesitant in criticizing Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. Today, they are in line with the West. At the beginning of this year, on January 14th, Japan's Prime Minister Kishida said, "Ukraine today, maybe East Asia tomorrow." I think that's a strong statement, making an explicit connection between Asia and the war in Europe, calling the security concerns of these two continents inseparable. Japan's territorial disputes over islands with both Russia and China, which have conducted joint military exercises near Japan's coasts, Japan's proximity to Taiwan, China's aggressive military actions around self-ruled Taiwan, which Beijing claims to be its territory, Korea, of course, technically being still at war. All these are real security threats in Asia. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, who is in Washington at the moment, who is in the US at the moment, called Russia's aggression unlawful. Not supporting Ukraine and not responding to an invasion with sanctions would potentially lead to wrong conclusions by North Korea. Any military escalation in the region would be devastating for the security and the economy. So it is in the highest interest of Japan and South Korea to keep and maintain peace and stability in Asia. Unlike in the past, both countries have decided to take a tough stance against Russia this time and to join international sanctions by enforcing trade sanctions and financial sanctions. In terms of trade sanctions, we have tightening export controls led by the US and the EU, raising tariffs on imports from Russia, export bans on strategic items such as semiconductors that would serve Russia's military purposes. And in terms of financial sanctions, South Korea and Japan have both introduced asset freezes on Russian individuals and financial institutions. South Korea has also supported the removal of some Russian banks from the SWIFT international payment system. Before the war in Ukraine, South Korea was actually Russia's second largest trading partner in Asia, after China, of course. Trade between these two countries has decreased since the war. South Korean exports to Russia declined by more than 35% last year. Exports of memory chips have almost completely stopped. Imports from Russia fell more than 10%. However, both countries, South Korea and Japan, are still very dependent on Russian gas imports. Russia provides about a quarter of South Korea's crude oil exports. They're long-term buyers. They have renewed their deals with the Sakhalin-2 LNG project so that its revenues might even double this year as LNG prices are higher at the moment. South Korea has slowly begun reducing imports of Russian petroleum and LNG. However, imports of Russian coal have increased by over 14%. Very similarly, if you look at Japan's LNG imports from Russia last year, it has very much gone up. So both for South Korea and Japan, this balance of being Russia's trade partner on the one hand and antagonizing Russia in the war on the other hand is a huge challenge. Russia included both countries among its list of unfriendly states. But nonetheless, both countries continue to support Ukraine with humanitarian aid and economic support. According to the Kiel Institute of the World Economy, Japan donated 5.66 billion euros to Ukraine. And recently, Japan's Foreign Minister Hayashi pledged to send an additional 1 trillion yen, which is about $7.5 billion, including $471 million to the World Bank Ukraine Relief, Recovery, Reconstruction, and Reform Trust Fund. That's very long. In total, South Korea has committed to providing around $230 million to help Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees. Money Ukraine needs to rebuild its country. For medical supplies, of course, vaccines, and electricity generators. Japan's military support, however, has been limited to helmets, bulletproof vests, and drones due to its pacifist principles. South Korea has provided non-lethal military equipment as well, but also and transferred South Korean-made components for arms to Ukraine via NATO member Poland. But are all these supportive measures enough if the strategic partnership between Putin and Xi Jinping continues thriving? Those two seem to have created a perfect alignment which serves their purposes. But what exactly is China gaining out of it? Well, their biggest and most obvious mutual interest is to divide the West. This partnership has also created an economic win-win. While Russia's military is running out of supplies and their economy is struggling under Western sanctions, China has significantly increased trade with Russia by 30% last year to $185 billion. This year, China's trade with Russia is expected to top $200 billion. So you could say for China, this could go on for a while. And Russia has found a way to compensate its economic downfalls by selling Russian fuel to China at a discount price, which, by the way, India, the third largest oil consumer in the world, is taking too. Prior to the war, South Korea saw Russia as a potential partner due to its leverage over North Korea. This sort of cooperation now seems very unlikely. And engagement with North Korea overall has become very difficult. Last year, while the world was focused on Europe, no one really paid serious attention to North Korea. In 2022, North Korea launched at least more than 90 missiles, more than ever before. And just recently, North Korea fired an ICBM toward Japan, Pyongyang's 12th test of this year so far. So Kim Jong-un's observations of the war will reinforce his commitment to self-reliance and regime survival. He's seeing a Ukraine with no nuclear weapons, a country that gets attacked by its big neighbor, Russia, overnight. The major takeaway for North Korea is that Ukraine is paying the price for having given up its nuclear arsenal in 1994. A perfect example for him of what could happen to weaker countries that get entrapped in great power conflicts. And a major argument for Kim Jong-un, of course, to move his nuclear weapons program forward and move closer to the Russia-China bloc. But Russia's war in Ukraine has undeniably strengthened US alliances in Asia as well. It has brought South Korea and Japan closer to their mutual ally, the US. At the same time, the difficult relations between South Korea and Japan have improved very quickly under the current leaders, President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida. This bilateral and trilateral alliance is value-driven, an opportunity to demonstrate political leadership and responsibility for fellow democracies. Especially South Korea is a country that remembers all too well what it means to be at war, a country that once received international support as well. But of course, South Korea and Japan have their own interests. They are siding with the West while having the underlying but unambiguous expectation that the international community will also step in case of future tensions in Asia. The US remains the key ally in the region, but thanks to Russia, one could say, NATO feels triggered to move closer to like-minded partners in Asia as well, and to expand security cooperation in the region. Russia's war on Ukraine somehow shows us what might happen if a military escalation in Asia breaks out. A scenario which would entail a whole different level of challenges, as the economic dependencies with China are far bigger than with Russia. So the major challenge for countries like Japan and South Korea at the moment is to participate in the US-led coalitions supporting Ukraine while trying not to break all ties with Russia or China, because complete decoupling with China seems impossible. Against this background, both countries have begun rethinking their own defense capabilities and whether they should enhance military deterrence. Is South Korea going nuclear? These are very recent headlines, underscoring the fact that according to polls, over 70% of South Koreans are supporting their country to having nuclear weapons on their own. South Korea would be on the front line of any confrontation with the China-Russia bloc. China-Russia-North Korea bloc, in fact. These concerns are especially voiced by people in South Korea now who strongly oppose sending arms to Ukraine and who believe that this would heighten tensions on the Korean peninsula. It is, of course, a very complex debate, which leads me to the question, is direct military support from South Korea to be expected? So far, Seoul has only sent non-lethal aid, including bulletproof vests, gas masks, helmets, medical supplies, citing a law in South Korea that prevents it from arming countries in war zones. However, the government has already approved the export of arms components via NATO member Poland. The pressure on South Korea has been growing. Pressure from the US, but also from the EU. In January this year, NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg visited South Korea, asking for military support to Ukraine. South Korea is one of the fastest growing arms manufacturers in the world. So the question whether it should send lethal aid to Ukraine directly is a very sensitive debate. And South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol himself has recently opened a window through an interview. This is what he says. If there is a situation the international community cannot condone, such as any large-scale attack on civilians, massacre, or serious violation of the laws of war, it might be difficult for us to insist only on humanitarian or financial support. This statement itself becomes a deterrence measure because it says to Russia, we are already on your list of unfriendly nations. So stop killing people in Ukraine. Otherwise, we could and maybe will take harder measures. Russia, of course, has replied immediately. To our regret, the Kremlin spokesperson said Seoul has taken a rather unfriendly position in this whole story. Of course, the start of arms deliveries will indirectly mean a certain stage of involvement in this conflict. At the same time, the South Korean president has also set a completely new tone in the China-Taiwan debate, saying that the security of Taiwan is a global concern. This is his quote. The Taiwan issue is not simply an issue between China and Taiwan, but like the issue of North Korea, it is a global issue. Both China and Taiwan are very careful not to draw too close analogies between Ukraine and Taiwan, because this is the daunting narrative no one really wants to talk about. But China's aggressive actions on the Taiwan Strait, incursions into Taiwan's air defense zones, force us to ask this question. Is Xi Jinping supporting Putin, expecting in return support from Russia, when it may feel forced to take action on Taiwan? And as brutal as it might sound, is Taiwan going to be the next Ukraine? There is no country in Asia that wants open confrontation with China. But China also needs to realize that the limitless friendship with Putin, that China's support to Russia, will eventually have its limits. Because what would China really gain out of a military partnership with Russia? By sending weapons to a country that is getting weaker and weaker? By risking to entirely cut ties with the US and European markets that are actually far more important for Chinese economy than Russia? We all know that China has the power to do more, or do less first, by stopping to support Russia and prolong this illegal war. We might not expect an overnight miracle, but since yesterday, there is some new hope that China recognizes its true potential of being a peacemaker. So are Asian states, including China, willing to step up and become more assertive in defending peace during these times? I believe that South Korea, Japan, together with Singapore and Taiwan, these leaders could form a coalition for peace in Asia, sending a clear message that similar developments in the region will not be tolerated. They can inspire and they can lead other Asian countries to join international solidarity to end this brutal war in Europe as soon as possible. If Asia can learn something from the ongoing war in Europe, it's that you'd better be prepared and start deterring a bigger conflict before it's too late. For Ukrainians, the war did not start last year. It began on February 20th, 2014. Despite numerous warnings, many people in Europe did not want to believe that war on their continent in the 21st century would be possible. But we all woke up one morning to war. So I want to end my presentation with a quote by the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, who recently visited South Korea and the DMZ zone. She said, "Solidarity is not a one-way street. If one day escalations arise in Asia, Asia will need the support of its allies in the West. The goal is not to provoke a conflict in Asia, but to deter it in the first place. And I believe that supporting Ukraine now is the strongest form of deterrence for Asia. If Asia expects solidarity, Asia should offer their solidarity now for Ukraine and for our peace." Thank you. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm now switching actually to the role of the moderator of today's very, very exciting panel, which I cannot wait. I would ask my dear panelists to come up the stage and join me up front. We have 3 people in person and 1 person joining us via Zoom. Hopefully he will join us. Right, so I'm super excited that we have an incredible panel today with very distinguished speakers. So let me introduce them to you first. Professor Christina Davis, she is a professor of government at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. She is the director of the program on US-Japan relations and the co-executive editor of the Japanese Journal of Political Science. And her new book, Discriminatory Clubs, the Geopolitics of International Organization, is going to be published this summer, I guess this July, so already on my reading list. Welcome, Christina. Next to her, Lucy Hornby. So happy to have a fellow journalist in the round. She is also a visiting scholar here at Harvard's Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies and a senior associate at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington. She lived and worked in China for almost 20 years, reporting for Reuters and the Financial Times. Happy that you're with us today, Lucy.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we had one more panelist on the list, Professor David Gang from the University of Southern California. Unfortunately, because we moved everything to the front, he unfortunately told us that he is not available at this point because he has other commitments. And then I'm not sure if we have our final panelist. This is like a real challenge now. Yeah, up to then, I will start introducing my very dear friend and colleague, Dr. Nishant Motwani. He was born in India, but now he is an Indo-Pacific Strategic Affairs researcher and currently a Mason Fellow, as well as a mid-career Master's in Public Administration candidate at the Harvard Kennedy School. Before coming to Harvard, he lived and worked in Afghanistan for several years. Welcome, Nishant.
Thank you very much.
And now we have our final panelist for today. We're moving all the way from Harvard to South Korea in the middle of the night. I think it must be now. What time is it?
It's 1:40.
Wow. So thank you so much, Dr. Ugyang, for still being awake. What time? And thank you so much. He is a research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies in South Korea, a renowned expert in military strategy and weapons system, and an active member of policy advisory committees in the South Korean government, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Joint Chief of Staffs. Welcome.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to start off with you, Christina. Ukraine today, maybe East Asia tomorrow. This is what Japan's Prime Minister Kishida said at the beginning of this year. What do you think drove him to make this very strong statement? What was his motivation? And how is actually Japan's support for Ukraine perceived by the public?
Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk with you and join this esteemed panel and the audience. It's great. This is an important topic. And your question is the right one to look at how Japan has tried to encourage a sense of solidarity. And I think your own closing remarks that the view solidarity towards support for Ukraine is seen as a step towards deterrence of China towards any aggression in East Asia. And so I think that is fundamentally the interests of Japan to make this analogy that East Asia could be the next Ukraine. Prime Minister Kishida began this statement actually over a year ago in May 2022 during his summit with Boris Johnson in London. And many of his comments have made this statement of East Asia could be the next Ukraine. He continued to repeat in his Washington summit. He also made the phrase when he visited Kiev in his momentous summit with President Zelensky. And the phrase East Asia could be the next Ukraine is important to make the analogy, and it has three audiences. One is the solidarity with the Western alliance of Europe and the United States to show that Japan is against the use of aggression, the violation of international law. It is also important for building domestic support. And so the Japanese public supports international order and international law. And making the analogy of this violation, the step of violence against Ukraine is a threat to international order, helps to mobilize Japanese support to see that they need to also support international order in East Asia. And the third audience is, of course, deterring China. So by solidarity against the invasion of Ukraine, hoping to send a strong signal to China. Another point I would say is that alongside East Asia could be the next Ukraine, that effort to make the analogy of one aggression could be the next threat in East Asia. Prime Minister Kishida has frequently said that he's opposed to the use of force to change the status quo. Now, that's different than the unlawful violation of international law and helps to strengthen the analogy of Ukraine to the possible scenario of a Chinese action against Taiwan. Because Ukraine is a member of the United Nations. The Russian invasion of Ukraine violates international law, which is why we saw the incredible consensus on the UN resolution. The scenario of a Chinese action against Taiwan is more complicated because Taiwan is not a member of the United Nations. And the one China policy has meant that many countries do not recognize Taiwan as having legal sovereignty. Hence, if you only talk about Ukraine in the context of a violation of international law, you're helping to differentiate. Whereas when you talk about opposition to use of force to change the status quo, you're making the parallel analogy where even if Taiwan does not have the status of legal sovereignty, an attack on Taiwan would violate the status quo. And that is an important benchmark. And so I think that this use of language is an important reference point to help the world see this analogy. And the hope is that Japan-Korea's solidarity with the West in the case of the violation of sovereignty of Ukraine could also hold up in the case of a use of force to change the status quo, should there ever be a scenario of Chinese aggression against Taiwan.
Thank you, Christina. Let's move to South Korea, Dr. Yang, because South Korea has also supported Ukraine very strongly alongside Japan. So how does the South Korean public perceive this strong stance against Russia? And is there anything to tell about the debate going on in South Korea about the China-Taiwan analogy?
I mean, well, at first, Korean public is not that much aware of the importance of this, Ukraine war, because thing is that, Korea, I mean, we have a, biggest challenge, North Korea, and I mean, we are so immersed in the Korean Peninsula. So at first, I mean, the debate started like the last presidential election, that right now the opposition party leader, the presidential candidate, that said that, I mean, well, the war in Ukraine is the fault of the Ukraine, not the Russia. So I mean that really bring up the big debate. So now, well, people generally agree that, I mean, we have to support Ukraine, but there's some problem just to provide the I mean the providing more than the humanitarian or economic support to Ukraine. I mean, let's say like lethal support, support to the lethal weapon to the Ukraine. I mean, that might make the security situation in Korean Peninsula kind of like a very complex, because, well, Russia can provide North Korea some high-tech weapons, then, I mean, that poses another threat to the South Korea. So, I mean, so this kind of complex situation make South Korean government cannot easily decide on the support of the Ukraine for exporting like ammunitions or other weapon systems. So I mean that's the situation. But generally, the Korean people believe that, I mean, we should help Ukraine. I mean, we already had like a Korean War, like like 73 years ago, and we should not forget that. I mean, there was a helping hands from all over the world, to defend South Korea. So I mean, the most of the Korean peoples are aware of it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yang. Before I move on with the Q&A, not the Q&A, the panel, I just want to tell our audience online, because we have a lot of people online as well, that you can ask questions in the Q&A box. So feel free to do so, because after the panel, we're going to have a Q&A so that I can read out the questions. I just wanted to make this announcement now so that people can think about their questions. But yeah, China. So we have those two cheerleaders, as I call them, South Korea and Japan. But then we have China, and China's role has been quite ambiguous in this whole conflict. On the one side, siding with Russia, and now this phone call yesterday. How do you read this phone call yesterday? We don't know a lot, but how would you kind of view this new development in the whole context of the strategic partnership between China and Russia?
Yeah, so obviously when it comes to China, we're really talking about the ultimate in black box politics, right? So we can see the outside of the box. We don't know what's going on inside the box. And so, to a large extent, you're stuck with, well, it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, must be a duck, but you don't know if it's a duck. So I think that there's a couple of things that I'd like to just kind of throw out there. One of them is the degree to which people find China's stance confusing, even though it's not really that confusing. It seems like they are pretty much strongly on the side of Russia. So the confusion is more on the part of the Europeans in particular, and the American business community as well, that we're confused between our economic alignments and our geostrategic interests. I think that's where the true confusion lies. A few other thoughts I'd like to throw out there. What's driving the China-Russia alliance, which has gradually become clear over the past 15 years, I would say. You've seen a real shift in China to moving more and more explicitly geopolitically positioning itself with Russia. One thing I think that we don't necessarily focus on is the initial driver for that seems to have really stemmed from relationships that were forged between the Chinese military and the Russian military shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, while the economic sectors in China, the business sectors became more and more Western-oriented, many academics became more and more Western-oriented, the broad public certainly became much more American-oriented within China. The two militaries engaged in very active trade between them in the 90s. And then you start to see other elements cobbled onto that. The energy alliance that we're seeing with, piped gas or shipped gas and crude from Russia into China. Those negotiations from an economic point of view, which is how we covered it as journalists, were often extremely fraught. Sometimes they didn't make any sense, actually, economically. But there was always this political will to seal them. And then you throw onto that the sort of psychological proclivity, I guess, of Xi Jinping, who, seems to still have as his mental framework the universe in which the Soviet Union was powerful, in which there was a Sino-Soviet alliance of equals, which was, of course, not the case in the 50s. So you sort of have this three-tiered structure that's built into what we see today of military, energy, and then personal on the part of the two leaders. They do seem to see eye to eye. That said, very briefly, I don't know anything more about what Xi Jinping was offering in terms of his peace plan than anyone else does. But I do think that the American think tanks are wrong to dismiss it out of hand. So when the Chinese first announced that in February that they were going to visit Moscow with a peace plan, the word out of Washington was, there's nothing to it. It's total fluff. There's nothing concrete there. I think that was a mistake. And the reason I think that's a mistake, without knowing what was in it, I mean, I have some guesses, but they're probably as good as yours. But the reason I think it was a mistake to think it was nothing at all was that Putin clearly didn't accept it. So whatever it was that she came with, something about it Putin found to be unacceptable. So to me, that means that there was at least some hard content in there that's worth considering and trying to figure out what it was. And, you know, Putin's kind of funny sometimes how he phrases things, but he gave a press conference after his meeting with Xi, and he said something along the lines of, you know, Party's General Secretary Xi just kept banging on his peace plan. You know, you definitely got the sense that there was something in there that Putin wasn't happy about. From the Chinese actions since their meeting, we again can guess that there was some daylight between the two sides. And personally, I would guess that it's around the thing that's making the Chinese really worried is the possibility of nuclear, some sort of nuclear element to this conflict. Those are my thoughts. Happy to talk about them more. But, you know, really it's just speculation from all of us because we weren't a fly on the wall, unfortunately for us.
Just very briefly, because I see we still have this picture up there. What are this? Because it's all about symbolism, isn't it? So very briefly, what can you tell us about the partnership? What does the picture tell us about China and Russia?
Well, there's a few things. One is this room. As you can see, it's a very, very ornate room. It was apparently a ceremonial throne room or crowning room during the Tsarist times. So in Putin and Xi's interactions with each other, there's a lot of kind of mutual stroking and, you know, giving each other all these sort of frills and furbelows of high leadership. And this room would definitely be part of it. The other thing that's interesting about this room is that Mao and Stalin met in this room. So when Putin and Xi meet in this room, there's a lot of resonance. It's not like they just chose any room in the Kremlin. The final thing that I found interesting is that you notice Xi's brought his own water. See, he brought a thermos. And, you know, I don't know what that says, but does he really think Putin's going to poison him? I always say, if I ever get to ask him a question, I think that one of the questions will be is, you know, why do you feel the need to bring your own water when you go meet Vladimir Putin?
Absolutely. Thank you. We're all so focused on China, but how about India in this whole context, Nishank? Because India has not condemned Russia's war in Ukraine nor joined international sanctions because of dependencies. So tell us more about how deep are these dependencies between India and Russia and how big are India's benefits out of this war?
Thank you very much, Yana, and thank you so much for inviting me and being. It's a delight to be part of this distinguished panel. Looking at India, I think we have to look at the historical ties that exist between India and Russia. They have been longstanding strategic allies and I think one of the ways in which this manifested was just at the outbreak of the India-Pakistan War in 1971. One of the key agreements that was signed a few months prior to that was the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation between the former USSR and India, and that played a role in keeping the Americans out of the conflict when India was able to defeat Pakistan decisively and led to the creation of Bangladesh out of East Pakistan. So USSR, Russia has been a steadfast strategic partner for India. And more closer to our time was in 1998 when India conducted nuclear weapons tests. There was international condemnation of those nuclear weapons tests. There were a few countries that didn't. Russia was one of them. So that's a reflection of India, that it can rely on Russia for support at the UN Security Council level. But moving to bilateral relations between Russia and India, there is significant defense military relationship between the two. And it goes beyond just simply buying hardware. True, 70% of India's lethal armaments come from Russia. But I think what is often lost in the discussion is that the way in which India prepares for war and would engage in war were to happen against China or against Pakistan, the very doctrines are based on what it has in terms of capabilities. So this is not just about substituting different military hardware from either purchasing from the US or Israel. It would require a fundamental shift in the way the Indian military operates So that is a very strong consideration. And Russia has proven to be a reliable partner when it comes to defense relations. After the nuclear weapons test that India conducted in 1998, sanctions were levied against India, which particularly on one of them being the GE-404 engine, which stymied India's development for its fourth generation fighter aircraft. Russia was willing to step in and provide other technologies, and there's growing collaboration between the two in that field. And the third reason would be China. India has a long-standing border conflict unresolved with China, and for a long period of time, that border has been lying dormant. It is no longer dormant, and in 2020, when the Galwan Valley clash took place, where 20 Indian soldiers were clubbed to death by Chinese and 4 Chinese were reportedly killed, I think it's a reflection of the point where India's strategic relations with China are certainly gaining more tension. So the last thing that India would want to do is to have its strategic partner, which is already becoming much closer to China, is to push it in China's direction. I think the other advantage of having India and China for both of them to have strong relations is that it opens another avenue for diplomacy, for back-channel diplomacy, particularly if the US wanted to engage with Russia. India would be one of those potential partners.
Thank you. Dr. Yang, prior to President Yoon's state visit to the United States, the hottest debate in South Korea was the question whether to send lethal aid to Ukraine or not. In fact, President Yoon himself has opened this window through this interview with Reuters. Can you tell us a little bit more, because you're also part of the advising team in the government, what exactly drove President Yoon to make such a strong statement? And of course, I'm also interested in your personal opinion because you advise the government. What would that mean if South Korea, in fact, really decides to step up and not only send unlethal, but also lethal aid to Ukraine?
Yeah, well, I mean, let me first tell you that, I mean, there is no significant change in the policy right now. But what the president said is that, I mean, he will provide the weapon support if, I mean, the Russia is keep attacking innocent civilian and making some much more massacre. So, I mean, well, as you know, this South Korea wants to, help the world that re-establish the orders. I mean, kind of like, well, I mean, as you said, we called it the global pivotal states that, I mean, we can have the reinstall the order and value in this world. And the thing is that, I mean, our policy is that we'll provide the humanitarian aid and economic support and while the compliance with the international sanctions to Russia. But, I mean, we could not provide the lethal weapon, well, because of our, regulations. The thing is
So you
that
mean this? You mean this war, right? This law in South Korea.
Of the South Korean law. Yeah, our Defense Acquisition Program Act prohibits the sales of the weapon system to the warring countries. Even if the government wants to amend the law, the opposition party is the majority in National Assembly. The opposition is very much against the support to Ukraine. I mean, they're the previous administration, the ones, I mean, who very much sympathetic to the North Korea and also China. Yeah. So the ruling party cannot be the majority in the next general election, I mean, which is supposed to happen next year. There will be no amendment in the law. And that's one thing. But I mean, well, the supporting our ally is but another thing. we can provide the ammunition and weapons to the United States, which is our ironclad ally for 70 years. And that's why we sell the ammunition to the US last year and lend the 500,000 155 millimeter artillery rounds, which were we call it the Warsaw K, which means the wartime reserve ammunition for Korea. And we are also providing our weapon system like K2 tanks and K9 howitzers to NATO countries such as Poland. So those countries can directly provide the weapon support to Ukraine. Also, the Korean weapon systems that arms the NATO countries can be posing a great threat to the Russian military, which will contribute toward the security of the NATO.
Very briefly, Dr. Yang, President Yoon met with President Biden yesterday. Do you know anything about whether this was an issue? Did they talk about it? Was it on the agenda? Or do you know any kind of information whether the US tried to pressure South Korea to do more?
Yes, U.S. was, were pressuring all the time, but I do not believe that. There was a direct pressure from the, Biden to his, in the state visit of Yoon that, some of the Ukraine issue came up, but there was no, direct, pressure or something like that happened.
All right. Japan has also stuck only to non-lethal weapons so far. Is there any debate in Japan to step up and to send lethal aids as well? Or would that collide too much with Japan's dependencies on Russia's oil and gas? Is there a debate about that? Christina.
So Japan sent some helmets, I believe. But there's been significant humanitarian aid and significant support in the economic sanctions against Russia. So the two sides of showing strong support for Ukraine with economic assistance and strong opposition to Russia through sanctions, the government has been very rapid and comprehensive in its policies. And the sanctions included financial asset freeze, suspending most favored nation on trade policy, and targeting specific Russian individuals. And we see this broad policy supported by the public. Over 70% of the Japanese public have supported solidarity with Ukraine, strengthening sanctions, and even when they see that it has caused some increase in cost at home. And so I was interested to look at a recent poll in Nikkei that said 64% of Japanese feel their lives have been affected, mostly through higher prices in commodities and energy. But you still saw many saying, 56%, a solid majority, saying they supported strengthening sanctions in energy import area. So 70% support stronger sanctions. And even recognizing that the higher price of gas is hurting their livelihoods, you saw a majority supporting that Japan's government could go to more sanctions on energy. So I think the public support is there. Of course, saying this in a survey is different than dealing with economic consequences and supporting the government. But the energy dependence is there, not as severe as Germany. But Japan has a tenth of its liquid gas from Russia and a major investment in the Sakhalin plant by Mitsui and Mitsubishi, and the government has supported retaining those contracts for liquid gas from the Sakhalin plant. And so I think that there's certainly, that is one area where the government has put some boundaries on how much support it can have. And the logic was if Japan were to liquidate that project, it would only be a benefit to China. And so it's one thing when Shell and Exxon withdrew, but Japan had helped to invest in building this project in Sakhalin for a very important energy supply to Japan to diversify its energy. And there has been resistance by the government and the companies to stopping those contracts.
Talking about dependencies, Nishank, is that the main reason why so many Southeast Asian nations have kept silent so far? I mean, only Singapore has imposed sanctions, and even the Philippines, a close US ally, hasn't joined sanctions so far. What can you tell us about Southeast Asia?
Thank you. I think about Southeast Asia, especially if you're looking at the ASEAN countries, they function on the basis of consensus. And it would be very difficult for any one of them to come out openly, with the exception of Singapore, of course. And Singapore is a unique case itself. It is a city-state. It has got the smallest territory that's available to it. And so it feels very at risk if such aggrandizement were to take place in its by any of its neighbors, Malaysia being right to its north. So for Singapore's case, sovereignty is a matter of great strategic importance. Not to say that it isn't for the others, but it does have also the other aspect which works in its favor is that it has a strong defense partnership with the US. Not a formal alliance, but a strong defense partnership. In the cases of, if we look at APEC, well, it was Thailand, if I'm not mistaken, that was the hosted it. It went all out last year when it held APEC. And similarly, if you look at G20, it was Indonesia that held the last chair and it handed it over to India towards the end of last year. There's a lot of, at least with respect to Indonesia, there is significant military and defense relations between Russia and Indonesia, and that relationship is only growing. There's also a lot of Russian money in Indonesian oil and gas, as well as in the coal sector, which again is another reason for the Indonesian government not to come out overtly to condemn Russia. Just as an aside, India, although it hasn't condemned Russia, it did come out with a strong statement after the massacre in Bucha came to light, and that particular statement was made public at the UN itself. So I have no doubt that privately as opposed to megaphone diplomacy, that India is able to express its issues with Russia regarding the war in Ukraine. That's also really important because China has territorial disputes with India and Pakistan and India as well. So from that perspective, it would be hard for India to come out and say, because of its dependencies on Russia, to condemn the invasion in Ukraine, but at the same time, through private diplomacy, it would be making those issues very clear.
Thank you. We've covered so far dependencies. We talked about military support and about the China-Russia strategic partnership. I want to spend some time on China-Taiwan because I really think that since pretty much the outbreak of the war, the whole world has been looking at China and what is going on with Taiwan. Lucy, asking you first, because you've spent so much time in China and you're very familiar with this topic. How seriously worried are you about this conflict? And we've seen a lot of a strong civil society in Ukraine. Would you expect something similar in Taiwan? What is your take on that?
So, one interesting thing about this invasion of Ukraine was how quickly in America and in Asia, people leapt to the Taiwan analogy. In Europe, I think people were a lot slower to see any analogy at all. And so there was quite a push, I think, from some of the Americans and some Europeans, including some people in Germany, to bring that into the conversation. Diplomatically and geostrategically, I guess there are quite a few analogies. But physically, there's a lot of difference. Ukraine is flat and it's a land war. Taiwan is very mountainous. It's an island. It would be a naval and air war. So, the idea that Ukraine is sort of a trial run for Taiwan doesn't work physically, although it does work maybe geostrategically. And the other big difference is that you could easily see a scenario where the Ukraine war becomes a war of attrition over, if you want to start it from 2014, it's actually already been several years, and this current thing could be many, many more years, as long as people have steel to throw at each other. But Taiwan, any invasion of Taiwan would have to be over in a few days. So because of the way, the air forces are lined up, because of the nature of an island, and so the strategizing around invading Taiwan generally involves tying up the American forces so they can't get there within that critical 72-hour period, right? And then once you control the island, it'd be very difficult to get it back. So that's where the sort of the threat of the joint Russian-Chinese exercises come in. That's where I've heard one Chinese defense person, and this is well before Ukraine came into the picture, but he was like, if we invaded Taiwan at the same time, you would have North Korea invade South Korea, and so therefore the American troops in South Korea would have to stay there, and the people in Guam would have to go to South Korea, and then the people in Okinawa might come to Taiwan. But, you're looking at it in terms of tangling people up so that critical 72 hours can pass. Completely different than what you're seeing in Ukraine, where this could well go on for a very long time. And so I think the implicit threat is that having a two-front war or adding the Russians in just increases the ability to tangle things up and allow for a blitz invasion of Taiwan. But it's not at all a done deed that the Chinese military would be ready for that.
Very briefly, what is your perspective on the timeline? Because there are very different perspectives on that. Some people say it might happen in the next 5 years. Some people say it might take a bit longer. It's not a matter of if, but more a question of when. What is your personal opinion?
So I think it's incontrovertible that in China, there is only the when and there is no if, right? I've yet to meet anybody in the PRC who does not think that Taiwan belongs to them, right? So there's no question of there being sort of a debate around that. The question is, are you ready to do it? By what means can you do it? And so in Washington, there's been a lot of talk of Xi Jinping having an internal deadline of 2027. Other people think, there's a deadline of 2049. I'm not sure how much that's projection. Hu Jintao, who was Xi's predecessor, had a very, very savvy policy of trying to integrate Taiwan with China as much as possible, socially and economically and in every other respect. And if it had been allowed to play out that way, it might have been a very successful strategy. At the point where the Taiwan economy and the Taiwan society was so integrated with China that there wasn't a lot of difference, then who would gainsay if the two countries decided to come together, right? But Xi Jinping has decided to take a much more hardline approach, and that's created a counteraction. So I'm not sure that I feel that we can really pin a deadline per se.
Dr. Yang, does South Korea have a Taiwan strategy? Because for South Korea and also for other countries in Asia, it is indeed a dilemma. Having close economic ties with China and being a close ally of the United States, which is supporting Taiwan. So what is the plan?
Yeah, well, I mean, the South Korean government would not directly support Taiwan. Well, I mean, it's because of the relation with the China, and not just because of relation with the China, but I mean, what we should prepare in times of Taiwanese war. I mean, we should prepare the invasion from the North Korea. I mean, because those things could definitely happen together. I mean, maybe the North Korea would attack South Korea first, and then China can attack Taiwan, or Chinese start the war, and then North Korea will say, "Oh, this might be the great chance," and they will start attack the South Korea. So, I mean, we are. I mean, when in times of war in Taiwan, I mean, we have to be more vigilant against North Korea. But the thing is that since we are the ally of the U.S., I mean, we will, provide the real line support for Taiwan, working something like that, like the U.S. bases in Korea can support the Taiwanese, campaign. But the thing is that the U.S. Military, U.S. forces in Korea, I mean, they are not quite, well tailored for the, overseas operations. I mean, they are really, tailored for the war in Korea. So what we can provide in the war of Taiwan is that kind of like maybe some ammunition support for the United States, and providing the air base to the United States. Or so I mean that's the limit. That's the best South Korea can do.
As you've already mentioned North Korea, which was actually my next point, but let's stick to North Korea then for a second. Because North Korea has fired so many missiles since the outbreak of the war, where do you see the connections, and what lessons does Kim Jong-un really draw from this war? Are you really afraid that North Korea is moving even closer to China and Russia?
Yeah, well, the thing is that in 2021, when the eighth party congress is opened, the Kim Jong-un said that I mean they will have a tactical nuclear weapons and capacity to strike the enemy. And last year, North Korea have a make a new law which called it that the Nuclear Forces Policy Act. I mean, which widen the use of nuclear weapon. I mean, if I see the Article 6 of those acts, I mean, they suggested the 5 conditions when they use the nuclear weapon. I mean, which means that in every situation they can use the nuclear weapon, even in terms of conventional war. I mean, they will use the tactical nuclear weapon. I mean, that's what North Korea is saying. And I mean, this is well, I mean, what KJU learned from the Ukraine war. The Putin is threatening the Ukraine and the other countries that I mean they will use the tactical nuclear weapons. I mean, if the NATO countries or Western came into aid, I mean that is their lesson. I mean really impressed the Kim Jong-un. So I mean he wants to course South Korea, Japan, and of course the United States, and I mean the North Korea wants to take the initiative. I mean what Kim Jong-un think is that with robust tactical nuclear forces, they can strike the major counterforce target in Korean Peninsula and Japan. Well, Kim Jong-un think that I mean he can earn and fix the status of de facto nuclear state.
Japan obviously is also very worried about North Korea and has already announced to raise its defense capabilities. Does it anything have to do with the war in Europe? What can you tell us about that?
Yes, the reformulation of Japan's defense strategy had a long preparation period and is much more aimed with modernizing strategy and defense capabilities in light of the feeling of threat from China's activities in the region, the ongoing territorial dispute between Japan and China, and also against the context of the North Korean missile tests. So I would say those factors led to this major rolling out of a new national security doctrine this past December. But of course, that also occurred in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that further heightened the sense that the international order was threatened. And so for Japan to raise its target for defense spending to 2% of GDP by 2027 was a major step that will be controversial among the political decision makers to win support and to build support among the public. And I think that having the war in Europe and increased the sense of a threat environment that would justify that increased spending. And so, yes, their strategy specifically targets that unilateral attempts to changes in the status quo, use of force, lead to the need for Japan to increase its own preparation and reinforce its defense capabilities. And so I think that it is all tied together. And they also are pointing to Russia's increased activities in the area where Russia and Japan have a territorial dispute over the Kuril Islands. We have to remind ourselves Japan and Russia are still formally at war. They have not concluded a peace agreement. And right at the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Japan imposed sanctions on Russia, and Russia stopped the negotiations that had been ongoing with Japan over resolving that territorial dispute toward concluding a peace agreement. And so certainly that connection is very dramatic.
Nishant, how does India observe all these security threats in Asia concerning the China-Taiwan conflict, but also North Korea? Any idea with whom India would side in case of a conflict between China and Taiwan? And also maybe, let's stick to that question first.
That's a tough one. I think putting that, I hope I can answer this question, but I'll do so in a manner that looks at India's growing security cooperation with other countries in the Indo-Pacific. I think one of the foremost things to look at is the Quad. India has been increasing its cooperation with Japan, Australia, and the US in the quadrilateral security dialogue, as well as in stepping up its military ties, as well as foreign relations ties individually with each one of these countries. With the US, you have the 2+2 strategic dialogue. There is also a similar dialogue that takes place now between India and Japan, as well as India and Australia. And I actually happen to live in all of these four countries, so I follow them pretty closely. So from India's position is that it would like to see the status quo to sustain. It is against the use of force or the threat of force to change the status quo in any country's favor, which is why with the Taiwan question now, India and Taiwan do have strong economic links. It was, I believe, late last year that India and a Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturer have agreed to potentially invest up to $20 billion in India to set up a semiconductor plant. India would sees itself as part of the democratic diamond in a way where it could also provide critical technologies such as semiconductors if there was disruption to the situation in Taiwan, and is keen to capitalize on that opportunity, especially as there's so much pushback against China and divestment taking place from investments in China. So India, it would be hard to see India would come out on the side of anyone. It's played its role of being strategic autonomy for a very long time. It has not entered into any formal military alliances with any country. The closest that it came to was with the former USSR in 1971. So I don't necessarily see India supporting either country. It would come out and challenge if a war were to break out over Taiwan. But I don't see it coming to the aid of the US or any other country. Perhaps it may provide some basing, but that would be about it, as it did when Operation Enduring Freedom started in late 2001, and where India provided some basic logistics.
I'm really grateful that you mentioned the Quad, because we haven't really talked much about the Quad here. Maybe for some people in this audience or also on Zoom, just briefly explain what is Quad, and do you believe Russia's war on Ukraine has weakened the security framework in the Indo-Pacific? What is your perspective?
The Quad is an informal grouping of these four countries: US, Japan, Australia, and India. It was the brainchild of the former Japanese Prime Minister who was assassinated, Shinzo Abe, and he referred to it as the Democratic Diamond. It was effectively for the four countries to come together and to get increasingly aligned strategically, economically, culturally, socially, as a way to check against China's growing assertiveness. That was the vision that he had. The Quad itself, in terms of its military to military, they've been very careful in the language that they use as a way so that it doesn't give China the justification that these four countries are ganging up on China. They tread carefully in terms of describing their activities, and so far the Quad's activities have taken place primarily in the delivery of humanitarian aid. They do conduct naval exercises. There was a period in the late 2000 and early 2010 to 2014 period where where the military exercises under the umbrella of the Quad weren't taking place, because at that point China was making strong objections, and India was still trying to balance its relations with China because clashes hadn't occurred at that point. However, since China's growing assertiveness, India has come out more openly and willingly to push back against China's territorial claims, and it sees Quad as one vehicle, as a way to pressure China, that here is a very significant alternative. So that was the first part to the question. What was your second part?
Do you think that the Quad or the security framework has been weakened since the war? Because there are some countries having different opinions.
I think perhaps the opposite. I think there's growing strategic ties, and if anything, it has accelerated the integration and proximity of ties between countries that otherwise were not getting along. And I think Japan and South Korea is a very good example of that occurring. I mean, the South Korean president is going to be speaking at the Kennedy School tomorrow, so it'll be really interesting to see what he has to say. And there'll be a lot of people there who would like to ask him questions. But given the long-standing animosity between South Korea and Japan, and how much the U.S. has tried to bring these two allies under its hub-and-spoke model together, perhaps I would argue that Ukraine has provided that ballast for the two countries to come together, because they both see China as an increasing increasing threat. India also playing the strategic autonomy card has been growing increasingly closer to the US. That's reflected in its defense cooperation, military ties, but also the increasing economic partnership between the two countries. India's role in the US has been elevated significantly, and particularly the US is trying to court India as a way. What it would like to see is that India be a swing state that could come into action if there was growing. If a hot war were to break out. So they want India to be an ally on their side, whereas India is not very willing to be an American ally.
Fantastic. Before I open the Q&A, I want to raise one final question to all of you panelists. The same question, so please go ahead and share your thoughts on this. So let's come back to our original topic today, because we've had a long journey, starting off with the response of Asian countries to the Ukraine war, moving on to security threats, and now coming back to the question, do you think that Asia, and in particular your country that you're representing today, should step up in supporting Ukraine? And if yes, how would that look like? And if not, how would that look like? Maybe let's start off with Christina.
I don't think I can represent Japan, but if I were to give recommendation, I certainly do think that the current position of the government to have strong solidarity on economic sanctions, public statements of condemnation of the invasion of Ukraine are both really important pillars for Japanese foreign policy and its national interest to lay down the line as a deterrent for future actions of that nature in its own region. The question of military aid is much more difficult for Japan given its history and legal constraints. And I think that it would not be possible or wise in Japanese politics to try to breach the sending of lethal aid or participation in conflict zones for a conflict that is so far from its own geographic national interest. So I would say more on the same of sanctions and moral support, public support, economic aid to Ukraine would be the best policy.
Thank you, Christina. Lucy?
Well, I think for China, the question is not so much its support for Ukraine, but whether it steps up or down its support for Russia. And, obviously an interesting question. I think it's not impossible that one thing the Chinese are offering to both sides is the idea that, we can come in and do the rebuilding contract. We're ready, willing, and able to supply rail lines, new housing, and all that. So that probably, I would say, is on the table for both sides. But other than that, it's really a question of how far is China willing to go to back Russia?
Thank you. Nishant?
I think for India, the violation of sovereignty is something that's very critical to it. But at the same time, because of this difficult situation it is in having very strong relations with Russia, it is prioritizing its national interest. At the same time, it's a strategic competition that it has with China, which militates against its ability to come out and speak openly against Russia. And just yesterday, the Pakistan's chief of army staff has started his visit to China, which is again going to increase, which is going to continue, of course, a long tradition of relations between the two. But he's gone in with a list of things to buy from the Chinese, and the Chinese are more than happy to supply that weaponry. So India does prioritize that national interest. So I think where India can provide support would be in humanitarian support. I don't think that it would go beyond that at this point for the reasons that I've mentioned.
Thank you. Dr. Yang?
Well, I personally do believe that South Korea should, continue to support Ukraine. And I mean, personally, I'm really, agree to, sending the weapon system to the Ukraine. Not just the ammo. I mean, the high-tech weapon system to the Ukraine to defend the people of Ukraine and democracy. But as I told you, I mean, there's some limitation that, I mean, we are really, really, careful that, I mean, if we provide the Ukraine the weapon system, then Russia might provide the high-tech weapon to the North Korea, or I mean, Russia can even give the some missing link for the North Korean ICBM technology. So I mean that might endanger the United States, because I mean North Korea doesn't have the capacity to complete the re-entry vehicle for the ICBMs, and we think that it'll take like much more years to complete the development. But I mean, with the help of Russia, I mean, they might get the job done very soon. But I mean, but with all this threat, but I mean, we will have to keep the international rules going, and the value of the humanity and democracy, I mean, should be defended. So I think that I mean, Korea wants to be the global pivotal states. I mean, yes, we are, and I think that personally the President Yoon is also trying to help the Ukraine, but I mean, there's a lot of domestic political situation that doesn't allow this. But I mean, we're gonna keep trying.
Thank you so much for all of your contributions. And now I would say the floor is yours. Please raise your questions. Shortly introduce yourself or post your questions on the Q&A box on Zoom. I think we have mics. Yes.
Thank you for fascinating lecture. So I'm Takahiro Omori, visiting scholar at Weatherhead Center. I have a question for Dr. Motwani. So, so as you mentioned, the role of India is very important in this situation, I guess. So, during Ukraine war, we realized that Russian cannot make modern, for instance, modern tank without Eastern technology. So I wonder that what is the concrete benefit to keep relation with Russia for India? So I mean, for instance, does India need Russian military technology still now? So this is my question.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you. Since I'm here, sorry, I take the. Oh, yeah, please.
Yeah, I think we can go one by one. Okay, Nisha.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for your question. In terms of India's reliance on Russia for its military hardware and defense cooperation, I think that is very much the case. If you look at India's army itself, the Indian Army, it's comprised of T-72 tanks primarily, and the T-90 tanks as well. Both are of Russian origin. The Air Force is heavily, it is, I think, a logistics nightmare because you have British planes, you have Jaguar planes, you have Mirage, which are French jets, you've got Sukhois, you've got MiGs, and India has also bought Rafales recently. But the backbone of the Indian Air Force is very much Soviet and Russian in design because it still flies MiG-21s, which are also known colloquially as flying coffins because almost 200 of them have crashed over the last 3 decades, killing several pilots. So the defense cooperation and the defense relationship between the two is very strong. At the same time, they are involved in building and investing in technologies into the future. One of them is the BrahMos missile, which is approximately has a range of 280, 290 kilometers. And that is a missile that is deployed both by the Air Force and the Navy, and there's also a land attack version as well. There's also close cooperation in the nuclear arena. So India is developing its nuclear triad. And one of the only country to give India on lease a nuclear attack submarine in the 1980s was Russia, where the Indian Navy trained on those particular vessels as a way to bolster their own training, but also eventually with the idea that when India were to have a nuclear triad and to have a nuclear attack capability under the sea, that it would that only Russia was providing that access. So there's very close cooperation between the two countries, and the backbone of the Indian military, even at sea and in air, is of Soviet as well as Russian origin. Over the last 20 years, there have been a lot of steps that have been taken place as a way to limit the extent to which India is reliant on Russia, but also so that it can procure more advanced technologies. So India has purchased, for instance, C-130 Hercules aircraft, Globemasters, Apache helicopters, as well as other as well as AWACS planes, which have been installed with the Israeli aircraft industries, Falcon radar mounted on top, as a way to divest from its reliance on Russia And but at the same time, that, as I was said at the start of one of my responses, was that around 70% of India's military hardware is still Russian/Soviet in design. But more importantly, it's the way in which India has trained to fight a war. Its doctrines are based on Russian capabilities that it has, and changing that will take decades to happen. Russia has proven to be a very reliable ally in that, defense supply in that regard. India does not have that same degree of confidence anywhere near it that the US would be a substitute, given how in its own neighborhood with Pakistan that it has shut off the tap when it came to the supply of F-16s, for instance, to the Pakistani Air Force. It stopped that.
Before we move on to the next question, I just learned that Professor David Gang is in the Zoom call. He can join us now. I know it's kind of late, but better late than never. Maybe that would be cool if we could also bring him in so that we can at least ask him one final question. But until we have him in, let's go on with our question.
Thank you. Since I'm here, so I make good use of the place. So thank you very much for Professor Davis and Lucy, Nishak and Young for your wonderful presentation about Asian perspective. It's always good, and I believe it's more for the Ukraine issue. But I want to add one more thing. I think for the Ukraine issue, I think we have a consensus. Okay, that were on board of the sanctions are not really very representative of all Asians. So we need to take into mind the complexity and the diversity. And the second, that we don't have model. Okay, they do not represent a model. I think all other Asian nations it's very hard for them to follow. This is also true for Brazil, Nigeria, and maybe the other places. And also for Lucy, I think for the Chinese perspective of or Chinese stance of Ukraine, I would like to make a little maybe share a little some view, very shallow view of myself. I think for the West, especially Europe and America, China is very much pro-Russian, and our neutrality is fake. So there is a code of pro-Russian neutrality. But let me add one term is principled. So the limit of the no-limited relationship between China and Russia doesn't lie in the lack of trust, or doesn't lie in the pressure from international community, but more lies in the principles. The Chinese has three key principles. The first is sovereignty. Second is peaceful means. The third is non-nuclear. So non-nuclear means no use of nuclear weapons or threatening to use nuclear weapons. So in this sense, Russia has violated all three. So in this sense, China is not siding with Russia. So this we must be very clear, and there will not be siding with Russia from the Chinese side, even though. So this is something I want to say. And the second thing, I think the picture is very interesting. I like it, but we do not shouldn't overestimate the Russians' visit to Xi's visit to Russia, because if you see the picture of Xi receive Trump. The picture is more gorgeous. You will see he presented China's best, even though he really doesn't really like Trump. So it shows he's willing to have a good relationship with Trump, but it doesn't really mean that China agree with everything with US. So we shouldn't read very much, especially we see the timing. So he probably visited to prevent a nuclear possibility, because Russia is threatening days before. And second is that he hoped to avoid coming Russian failure, because that's also very foreseeable at that critical moment. And third is that he hoped to make something peaceful, something related to peace, because he had some success with Saudi Arabia and Iran case, so he hoped to do something more. So it's not really to show key support after the rule from the court, but actually he hopes to do something different. I hope that his intention should not be interpreted. And third, I want to say that China is now in a kind of is not really, but is kind of in a mid-person or kind of a neutral position, I think, which would be very critical for possible future peace possibility. While pushing China into the Russian side or forcing China on board of the US side, will be disastrous for the Ukraine future. I think that's maybe the possible, because if Russian feel that China even betrayed us, I think he will take any possible means, including nuclear. So that's what I want to add. Thank you very much but if you allow me a short question for Yong, for Korean. I mean, my question is about Korean's statement of Yong's statement over Taiwan. So is that more of a Korean choice or Korean voice, or it's more personalized for Yong himself as a Trump-style politician? Thank you very much.
Dr. Yang?
Didn't really get the question, but well, call the president, like Trump-like is, I mean, it's a bit of misunderstanding. Well, I mean, he says, I mean, his, strong, opinion, but still, I mean, he's, well, actually, he's a lawyer, not a businessman. So, I mean, that's why he's, keep telling about the, rule-based orders and, values and, rules. So, well, I mean, what he praises most is the rules and orders. I mean, that implies that include the international orders. That's what I can say.
Thank you. Christina, you also have something to add.
Right. Similarly, the support for international order. I think that your comment is an important one. The value of not having every country condemning Russia may lay a possibility for negotiators. And so in that sense, if China were to be neutral, it could have a peace plan to put forward. At the same time, I would push back on the idea that China has been neutral and not taken sides. Every country that is a member of the United Nations has an obligation to defend the United Nations principles. And this is a fairly clear case of a violation of sovereignty. And so the vote to abstain is not supporting the UN Charter. And because of the veto of Russia, there has not been authorization for UN military actions or UN authorized economic sanctions. But should those be authorized, it would be consistent with the Charter to take positive action against Russia. And so in that sense, I do believe the countries that have abstained or voted against the resolution are taking sides.
Before we move on with the question, I just want to introduce Professor David Gang, who just joined us. I'm so glad that you're with us all the way to the West Coast. Let me shortly introduce you to our audience. He is professor of international relations at the University of Southern California and also director of the Korean Studies Institute. And I would say his books, China Rising and Nuclear North Korea, co-edited with Victor Cha, have become classics for everyone who study Asian politics. So welcome, Dave. So glad that you could join after all your media appointments, I heard.
Sorry, I planned to join at 10:45. I'm really sorry, but then I had a bunch of things lined up earlier in the day when it got moved. So I'm late here, and I'm just happy to contribute however I can. So thanks for having me. And again,
no problem at all. We're so glad you could join even later. We covered a bunch of topics already. We've talked about the China-Russia strategic partnership. We talked about security threats, China-Taiwan, North Korea. So if you could maybe summarize your view on the whole issue, what Asia's response to the whole conflict in Europe is, and we've even talked about whether Asia should step up in supporting Ukraine, because clearly there are countries that are supporting Ukraine, but also not supporting Ukraine, supporting Russia. So what is your perspective on this very timely topic?
I'll just make a couple general observations and then, happy to go from there. I mean, the first one is, and you had a prompt for us on some questions earlier on about like what lessons are say Taiwan or China or North Korea learning from Ukraine. And I would make a point that probably not as much as we might think. In other words, I don't think that Xi Jinping is sitting there saying, well, if the invasion of Ukraine goes well, I'm going to invade Taiwan. There's much more local conditions that were going to cause a change in the status quo or the use of force in some way, much more than just a lesson. And I think it's the same thing for Kim Jong-un. It's not like he's saying, okay, if Russia or Ukraine does this, that, or the other thing, I will do more with my nuclear weapons. His nuclear weapons program is moving forward because of issues or concerns that North Korea has. And as I did just say on one of these, on one of the media, on one of the interviews, was like, they test not necessarily to send a message, not necessarily as a show of force or something else or to get attention. They're testing missiles, North Korea is, because they want to improve them. And every time they improve, they test, they can improve them a little bit, either stability or aim or whatever else. And so while there is a political component to what North Korea is doing, there's also a technical component. And in that way, I don't think that there's that as nearly as many lessons as we might think. If I would say, if there's one lesson, I think it's that the United States is very careful to get involved in a nuclear war or with a nuclear armed superpower in a war that is not central to U.S. National interests, no matter what we say about international order and things like that. We're very careful about getting involved in a war. And I think we should be, because that's really, really taking a risk. And one of the differences between Korea and Ukraine is we have 25,000 troops there. So to make an editorial comment about what's going on today, this whole Washington Declaration, I think, is far less, it's mostly political theater. It's not like extended deterrence by the United States had waned and they had pulled the troops out and South Korea is terrified. We just did massive military exercises with the South Koreans. So yeah, I mean, it's mostly performative, or there's a little bureaucratic tweaks here or there, but they will be involved in a war in the Korean Peninsula because we have 25,000 troops. That's their purpose, and so there are some lessons, but I think in other ways the local conditions actually matter more. And again, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And I love your cat in the background. So cute.
Sorry. Nice and sunny here. So
absolutely. I'm pretty sure you gave lots of interviews this morning on President Yoon's state visit to the US. So we also said that prior to this visit, the whole debate about whether South Korea should send lethal weapons to Ukraine brought a whole new dynamic into this topic. What is your perspective on that?
I think in some ways there's a lot of excitement or exaggeration about what might happen, and in some ways I think Korea continuing to send humanitarian aid is a really good step. I'm not sure that anybody wants to ramp up South Korea's involvement to a point where they don't necessarily know what they're getting into. So I mean, in some ways I think that the status quo, or whatever we want to call it right now, is looks fine to me.
All right. We have one question in the Q&A box by Pankaj Nagpal, who is asking, is a return to pre-war boundaries, specifically with Crimea continuing as an occupied territory, the realistic solution? Also, any views on Ukraine's NATO membership? So anyone who is willing to take a...
I don't have a huge view on the NATO thing, but it wouldn't have surprised me if the content of Xi's proposal included a return to the pre-February 2022 boundaries. So total guess here, but it's not unreasonable to think that people would say, okay, Russia, you had and you have held for 8 years the Donbas region. You can keep it, but withdraw from everything else. And we'll give you, money and loans to rebuild what you've held. It's not impossible that was the content of the Chinese proposal. In Washington, of course, we'll never accept that. But that is the facts on the ground. And so, if you were to envision a negotiated solution, that certainly is one of the things that you can logically envision. Now, whether Ukraine would want to accept it, whether the West feels that they have to accept it, whether Russia wants to accept it, those are totally different questions, but it's not irrational to think that that's a possible outcome.
Dr. Yang, I saw you started typing an answer. Do you want to comment on this?
The outcome of the war is, when I see the Ukraine war, it's much like the Korean War. The thing is that at first, the Russia was, diving into the Kyiv, but it's something like this. I mean, the Seoul was invaded by the North Korean, and I mean we were like shrunken to the very small southern part of the Korea, and then I mean suddenly with the counterattack, then I mean we retake a lot of area, and then the thing is that I mean we have this uh, the line, the long line of war that I mean we continue to do like 2 years of fierce fighting, but with not much of a well advance. The thing is that the Ukraine is a little bit different, but I mean kind of same because well. I mean, they are kind of like stuck in the middle of the world, and then a lot of people are keep dying. And the thing is that when we go back to the Korean War, then South Korean President Lee Seung-man, I mean, he wants to take back all the the Korea, and then I mean. And they don't want U.S. to stop the war, but I mean the Cold War, the politics, I mean, doesn't allow that, right? And then I mean they reach the armistice, and then well, I think that Ukraine might get the similar fate, like I mean, even if the Ukraine wants to fight more. The NATO countries or U.S. might have its limitation, and then I mean they will go to the armistice. I mean that's just my thinking.
It would have been really great to ask this question now, Minister Kuleba, who unfortunately can't be with us today, but we can ask him next time when he joins us for another event. But if I may add my personal view on this as well. Minister Kuleba recently wrote an op-ed in a German newspaper saying that there are more and more views at the moment asking for kind of making negotiations with Russia and to kind of find a compromise in between. But from what I could read in his op-ed, and also from what I hear from many Ukrainians who are really willing to fight until the very end, they're not willing to make any compromises concerning territories because they argue that any kind of compromise would be a victory for Russia. And I see we have the head of the Ukrainian Research Institute of Harvard University here, who is also one of the co-sponsors of this event. And I'm pretty sure you could add to this point as well.
Sure. Well, first, thanks to all the panelists, and to clarify directly the contemporary part of the Ukrainian Research Institute, Emily Channel Justice. I really appreciate all that you've presented today. It's given someone who's coming from the Ukrainian side a lot of context that I didn't understand, and I mean, this is what the Ukrainians have been saying from the beginning, is that no territorial concession is acceptable. None will be acceptable to the Ukrainian people at this point. And so I think that's a really important part of thinking about what negotiations will look like. I really appreciate all the information that you've given about why humanitarian aid has been what's on the table here. I think this is really it's a really big question. Of course, the more military capacity the Ukrainian military has, the smaller the humanitarian catastrophe that's created by Russian aggression. So again, these are really important sticking points. I had two questions, one specifically regarding China and China's interest in Ukraine before the war began, because China had been investing in Ukraine pretty substantially. China was responsible for the development of 5G networks in Ukraine. They were responsible. They tried to buy Motor Siege, which is this aviation manufacturing company. And so I'm curious to hear anybody's thoughts about the potential that kind of potential long-term interest that China has. You may also already know that the U.S. was very much against these developments, these types of investments from China, and the potential influence China could have in Ukraine. But the second question is a little broader. One thing that hasn't really come up in this discussion is the effects of this war on the rest of the world, largely in terms of food insecurity, is something that comes up a lot. This has obviously created, major long-term food crisis. How do you think that some of the potential interests of the countries that you're sort of speaking from, the interest in the countries that are affected, kind of several steps away by the war, not directly, not being in Ukraine, but the countries in Africa, for example, that Russian leaders have been meeting with and trying to get them to support on that UN, the voting list. Some of them abstained as well. So can you comment on the potential effect of some of those other allyships on these countries' support for Ukraine? Thank you very much.
Lucy?
Regarding China and Ukraine, one thing that we really saw since about 2010, I guess, I mentioned that there was a relationship between the Chinese and Russian militaries after the fall of the Soviet Union, but there was also a tight relationship between the Chinese and Ukraine militaries, and Ukraine sold a lot of the weaponry that it ended up with. After the Soviet Union fell apart, they were in active negotiations to sell some of those to China. But most recently, since about 2010, within China, there was a lot of discussions about strategic weakness in the area of food, in the area of arable land. And we saw a lot of Chinese investments, especially into Ukraine. But again, they engaged with Ukraine in the former Soviet element of Ukraine. So what we had was the Chinese, what they call the Bingtuan, which are kind of quasi-military farm, corporate farm agribusinesses that are located primarily in Xinjiang. And they took the lead in investing into Ukraine agriculture. And interestingly, their partners were almost always the successors to the Soviet-era state farms in Ukraine. So again, you have this structural ability to connect within that Soviet structure, whereas the Chinese have not been as able to relate to Ukraine from the point of view of, the private business, for instance. And so, that was very much tied to food security. And I think the subsequent discussions of the impact of the war in terms of food inflation, all that reflects Ukraine's status as a major exporter of grain and sunflower oil to the rest of the world. I don't know much about how Africa has reacted, but I do know that Mongolia, which I saw was on the list of abstentions, every time Russia moves forward in Ukraine, they do something nice to Mongolia because the Mongolian public flips out, because the Mongolian public sees a very direct correlation between the Ukrainian public and themselves as a former Soviet satellite state. And so the first time they invaded in 2014, the Russians forgave Mongolian debt like 4 days later. And most recently, moving forward into Ukraine again, and then the Russians are sort of champion some Mongolian priorities vis-a-vis the Chinese state. So I would guess similar processes are underway for the other former Soviet states. And I think that's perhaps a reason why you saw so many abstentions among what we call the stands when it regards Ukraine. It's not that the public is not very concerned, they are. But the Russians are quite savvy about giving concessions there.
Dave, how optimistic are you about China's role as a peacemaker?
Me?
Yes, you. He just had a phone call yesterday with President Zelensky, which apparently lasted for an hour. What do you read on this?
No, I would sort of share the skepticism, I think, of many of the other panelists. China can potentially play a great role. The question would be, is it actually going to do that, or is it just trying to position itself for two different audiences? Sort of the same way, again, that China could play a big role on Korea, but it has its own interests at stake. And so I watch what they're doing, but especially if the two sides are where Ukraine's not going to give up anything and Putin is still where he is, I don't know how much room there is for a negotiated settlement at this point. Maybe down the road, but certainly not in the near future, I would say.
All right, thank you. Yes, you've been waiting for some time now.
No problem. Actually, the last question you asked was similar to the question I have. Irv Plotkin, I'll say it's quietly MIT. Lucy's thought of what China might have said to Russia as, go back to the borders before the last invasion, and we'll help you build, because it's been 8 years. I have a little experience in negotiation, and unlike a Supreme Court judge, you can really examine a negotiator for conflicts of interest. Isn't are we 70 years of Taiwan independence, even greater than 8 years of Russia's invasion into the Ukraine? They seem to have such a different fundamental view, as their recent ambassador to France sprouted out, that I don't see how they could present themselves as a negotiator and with a straight face saying we'll accept what history has shown for the last 8 years, where they won't accept it for 70 years when it comes to their neighbor.
Right. I think James has a question.
Responding to that or not? Okay.
Maybe we can gather the.
I'd like to quote my dad on this, and he liked to say, "What's mine is mine, and what's yours is negotiable." So I think in international relations, that sort of is true of everyone.
Okay, great. Thank you all for your insights. Clearly we have a much kind of stronger representation of the voices coming from Japan, Korea, East Asia focus, and Nishank has pointed out South Asia connections, and also rightly, I think, brought up the position of Southeast Asia in all of this. And I think, thinking of ASEAN countries and also the more recent RCEP agreement that has united into probably the largest trading bloc in world history, Southeast Asia's importance in all of this is significant. And this, war in Ukraine is forcing difficult decisions throughout Southeast Asia. But the response that I've heard when I was there in December was rather counterintuitive, where all of the issues of the sanctions that were just brought up here, that one might say is caused by the Russian invasion into Ukraine, is treated rather differently, in saying that actually the cause of those problems of food security, oil prices, fertilizer, all of that was actually because of the Western sanctions, not because of the Russian aggression. So they treat it rather differently. But I think, other parts where you see perhaps even the Philippines leaning, although Singapore is the only one that's come out, you do have the assertion again now of U.S. forces on Philippine bases. And while Taiwan is certainly the bigger major issue here, we do have the so-called West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea, whichever side you place that, but where we already see the issue coming to the fore, forcing them to make decisions about that. The question I had mainly for Nishank, and I think you were maybe alluding to this, was a lot of the discussion was about military and military equipment and things like that. And I think one of the other perspectives you began hearing in other Southeast Asian countries was dependence upon old Russian military, and seeing the very poor performance of that equipment on the battlefield has caused many of those countries to rethink exactly their dependence upon that. So is that part of what's happening in India then, is in terms of realigning the types of military equipment that they are revising now? It sounded like you were sort of gesturing in that direction, it seemed. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that question. I think it's still very early days, because of course the war in Ukraine started in 2014, but this particular iteration of the war started more recently. In terms of, if we were just to look at the India-Pakistan dynamic itself, qualitatively the weapons platforms on both sides are pretty much the same. They both have a mixed bag of Chinese and American weaponry on Pakistan's side, and of course indigenously made platforms as well. And on India's side, indigenously made platforms which are pretty average in terms of performance. One of them being India's Arjun main battle tank, which has taken over 3 decades, and it's still clearing field tests because there's always some problem or the other coming up with it. And you have Russian armaments, and you have more modern Western armaments. So I think the way in which the war has played out and is playing out in Ukraine, for the way in which India, I think, would be looking at it would be to say that qualitatively, the equation between India and Pakistan has changed fundamentally. India is far more ahead in terms of its capability to be able to impose by force its will on Pakistan, potentially under the nuclear threshold. I wrote about this in 2014 and in 2018. I made the argument that there's room for a limited war under the nuclear threshold or a limited conflict under the nuclear threshold. And we saw that play out again in very small ways in 2016 when a contingent of Indian special forces crossed the border into Pakistan as a way to neutralize what they saw was a terrorist threat. And in 2019, when Indian Air Force jets bombed terrorist camps in mainland Pakistan. So the idea is that with India gaining more confidence as a way to use and exercise force against Pakistan, the question of its military hardware is, I would say, less of a point at this stage because of its diversification, but also knowing that Pakistan is a weaker state. I think the bigger concern is with China, and because it has a far larger military-industrial complex that it can bring to bear in a potential conflict with India, it has no doubt would have given raised a lot of concerns at the poor performance of Russia's forces in Ukraine. I think one of the key lessons there would be on logistics and the war-wasted storage that India would need to have to wage a potential either dual front conflict or a single front conflict with the two. So I think that dependence upon the Russian military is going to sustain. And where there are identified platforms, capabilities that need to be replaced, that process, I believe those discussions would be taking place now.
All right. I think we've covered a lot over the last, over 2 hours now. I really, really want to thank you all for joining this conference, either in person or via Zoom. I saw that we have lots of people on Zoom as well who followed this conference from afar. Thank you so much. Even though Minister Kuleba couldn't be here, the conversation isn't finished yet. He already said he wants to join us in the near future. So please watch out for part 2 of Asia and Russia's war on Ukraine. Thank you.
Jump in really quickly. First of all, just to thank for putting this, helping to put all of this together. And it was a really wonderful discussion. And thank all the panelists for your time today. Very briefly, since I didn't do this at the beginning, I did want to call out all the co-sponsors for this event, just so you know who all was part of this. And that included the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, thank you very much, the Korea Institute, the Lakshmi Middle and Family South Asia Institute, the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations, the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, and the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies. Basically includes every international center at Harvard, so including the Asia Center, and particularly Tenzin Nodub for all of his help, and Jorge Espada here, who they've been managing all the tech stuff. So thank you all again. This is a very important topic, very good discussion, and we, like Ina said, we will look forward to hearing the foreign minister whenever we get a chance. I think be very interesting if we can get more information about that phone call, but also the visit that took place even earlier, that the discussions between the two foreign ministers would be interesting to hear his insights on that. And thank you to Mr. Yang for signing in at what must be around 3 or 4 in the morning now, and to David Kong for coming in after his busy day. So thank you all again for coming and your questions. So thanks. Bye-bye.